The head coach for the national pentathlon team, he introduced me to these two guys. And they were both active duty SEALs that were basically on loan to train for the pentathlon. I looked at them and I'm like, I want to be like that. That's what I want to be. And once I got to the SEAL teams and once I got on that combat deployment and we lost some of my teammates, it changed my mindset. I had earned my trident by standing on shoulders of great men. And those men helped me to become the SEAL that I was. What I learned in that combat deployment would carry over for the rest of my Navy career, which is
welcome back to the show, Disruptors. I'm your host, Aaron Hale. This is Point of Impact. On the Point of Impact, we explore the minds, habits, and heart of high-performance leaders, from combat veterans and elite athletes to battle-tested entrepreneurs and everyday warriors, forging legacy through adversity. The mission here is simple: to give you the mindset, tools, and discipline to sharpen the edge, live with intention, and lead with impact at home, at work, and in your community. You're in for a special treat today, Disruptors. Today's guest is Jeff Gonzales. He's an entrepreneur, weapons and tactics expert, author, host of the Bulletproof Workshop podcast, and former Navy SEAL. Today, he's sharing his time serving as a Navy SEAL in South America during the height of the narco, terrorism, drug trafficking era, and his time after his service as a weapons and tactics coach, trainer, author, now podcaster. There's some definite insights as to his experiences in South America as a Navy SEAL and a whole bunch more. I hope you enjoy it. Shooters, when ready, flip your selectors from safe to semi and fire at will. Jeff, welcome to the Point of Impact. So glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Aaron. I am extremely happy to be here myself.
Shoot, I didn't even ask. Did I turn that light on? Can you see me?
I can see you, yes.
Okay, good.
You're not in the dark.
You know, the blind guy, occupational hazards, sometimes I've recorded entire shows where the camera wasn't even on.
I think that's awesome, first of all.
How do I look? I don't know. How do I look? I don't know.
I'll go grab my nods and we can do this for real.
I've done this show with other blind guys. What a disaster. So,
well, I guess there's something to be said about the blind leading the blind there.
I make this joke all the time. My wife is blonde, so it's the blonde leading the blind.
Wow.
She tells me.
All right, fair enough.
Anyways, this is not the Aaron Comedy Hour. I appreciate your career path. I started off in the Navy. I didn't go. I didn't go special warfare. I didn't go into special operations. I went in a totally different route as a cook.
Okay.
It took me. It was my learning curve. I guess my maturity was a circuitous route, but I went from a cook, and I learned along the way the maturity and all the duty and all of that. And by the time I had enough ambition for EOD, they're like, "No, you're going to stay a cook." That's why I had to change uniforms, go to Army.
Gotcha.
What how did you find your way to the SEALs? What was that? What was the path looking for you?
Well, I do love telling this story because it is, again, something we had mentioned off air, part of the legacy. And I grew up in the 80s and joined the Navy just out of high school. I think 3 or 4 weeks after I graduated from high school, I was already heading out. Maybe it was a little bit longer than that. I was heading to boot camp. And for me, I was feeling like the college route wasn't really in the cards for me. My parents, I would have been the first one in my family to go to college, and my parents wanted me to go to college. We went and visited a lot of colleges. And my athletic background, I was a swimmer and a water polo player, and I loved those sports. And that was the way I was getting into college, was through those through that kind of like sports aspect. And I went to the college campuses. I did the kind of like smile, happy face, do what I thought my parents wanted. But man, I was just like, this is not for me. I just do not find myself succeeding here in this environment. Unbeknownst to my parents, I had visited the recruiters a couple of times. Back then in high school, there was the career counselor. I don't know what they call them these days, but they were called a career counselor. And I went in there so many times. I took those tests so many times, and they came back with the same results each and every time. Find a job that you can do something outdoors, and they listed like a park ranger, smoke jumper, all these other types of.
I remember those aptitude tests. Right?
Yes, exactly. And, so I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to be a doctor. I'm not going to be an astronaut. I'm not going to be any of those, glorified careers. And I went to the recruiter because I wanted to, learn more about the SEAL teams. And back in the day, there was no internet. I know that sounds really weird right now, but my sons came into the world just as the internet was becoming super popular. So, they didn't know a life before the internet, basically. So the only way that you could learn about the SEAL teams was through what little public information was out back then. Very little. There were, I think, 2 or 3 books that didn't talk about the SEAL teams. They just kind of like gave a very big picture view of them. And when I went into the recruiter and I asked him about it, he kind of was a little put off by it because, it's not necessarily what they're trying to do. But he had a brochure. It was a 2-page brochure. On the front page was it was basically the special warfare, naval special warfare. So on the front page was the SEAL teams, and on the back page it shared the EOD and the Navy diving side of the house. So that was it. There's basically one brochure that talked about naval special warfare. And I remember I read through it and I was like, okay, all right. Went back. I really did not know anybody that had been in the special operations community, much less naval special warfare. And one of the things that I had done in high school was I got selected to be part of the pentathlon team, the national pentathlon team. And my coach at the time, my head coach at the swim center, he took me over to Fort Sam Houston. So I grew up here in San Antonio, Texas, and over at Fort Sam Houston is the headquarters for the national pentathlon team. And we went and toured it, and I got a chance to meet the coaches. And I don't know how this happened, but we walked into this office, typical military building, cinder block walls, very, very austere room with 2 desks facing each other. And in the chairs were these 2 guys, my coach and the head coach for the national pentathlon team walked me in there, and they introduced me to these 2 guys. And they were both active duty SEALs that were basically on loan to train for the pentathlon. And I got a chance to meet them, and they stood up, and I just was like, I looked at them and I'm like, I want to be like that. That's what I want to be. And what are the events in the pentathlon, by the way? Great question, because I didn't know what they were when my coach first asked me. I knew the triathlon, right? So a pentathlon is 5 sports, and the activities are running and swimming. There's equestrian horseback riding, so where you jump over the obstacles and whatnot on the horse. There's marksmanship pistol shooting, and then there's fencing. And I loved it. So I later found out that the pentathlon was like the perfect sport for me. The reason being is that the history behind the pentathlon was also
basic
very,
skills
very
of
cool.
war. Right?
Yes, exactly. So it goes all the way back to the French. The French and their the way they selected their couriers. So the courier was the most important part of the battlefield because they communicated orders between the top and the bottom. And so not being able to communicate to the front lines was a very bad thing. So the couriers had to be able to run, swim, ride a horse, fence, and shoot. And the best of those were selected as the couriers. And so that's kind of the history behind the National Pentathlon. So I thought that was actually rather apropos that I would later go on into naval special warfare. But after I met those guys, it was in my head, I was convinced that's what I wanted to do. And part of the reason why was because at the time, they were the best. Again, there was no internet, there's no information. It was a very, very small community at that point. I think the standing joke was that, you could fit all active duty SEALs on one aircraft carrier with room to spare. It was a very small community back then. And so when I had to fight the recruiter on this too. The recruiter was like not wanting me to sign up for that. He kept trying to say, well, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. And I stood, I also was underage, so I couldn't even enlist. Mm-hmm. And I entered into the delayed entry program just so that I could commit to what I wanted, which was, and back then the SEALs were not their own NEC. They didn't have their own NEC. They were just part of the Navy. Mm-hmm. So I had to get a rating from the regular Navy.
Source rate, right?
Yes. So my source rating was intelligence specialist. Mm-hmm. And between those two, it felt like that would be a good match for what I wanted to do in the SEAL teams. And it turns out it was a great match. So I eventually bullied him into doing what I wanted. Basically, I said, I'm not going to sign up if I don't get what I want. And I had enough gumption to figure out how to do that. And it worked. I got my orders. I was on the delayed entry program. I had to wait until the end of the summer. Basically, it was like middle of September when I left. So in the meantime, once I graduated from high school, I trained up for the National Pentathlon, and I went and competed. It was the junior nationals, so I was underage, so I could only compete at that level. But it was still a great experience. And as soon as I completed the nationals, I remember we were sitting at the table. My house, I have a younger sister, my mom and dad, and we were sitting at the table, and I was like, by the way, I joined the Navy and I'm leaving next week. That was the way in which I introduced my naval career to my parents, was kind of like just matter of fact at the dinner table one night. And it was great because they didn't have a lot of time to think about it. They didn't have a lot of time to worry about it. And when I left, when the recruiter came to pick me up at my house for me to leave, I remember my dad said this years later. He's like, you walked out the door, you never looked back. You got in the car, you drove away, and that was the last I saw you until I graduated from boot camp. So my point behind joining the SEAL teams was that I wanted to prove to myself that I could walk amongst the best. And that's what I had in my head for the longest time. It got me through boot camp and A school, and it got me up to BUDS, and it got me through BUDS. And my first deployment was a combat deployment. I was very lucky. And what I learned in that combat deployment would carry over for the rest of my Navy career, which is I learned that, my reasons for joining the Navy and wanting to become a SEAL were very individualist. Like I was thinking about myself, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could be the best. And once I got to the SEAL teams, and once I got on that combat deployment and we lost some of my teammates, I remember thinking, it became real to me at that point. And what I discovered shortly thereafter, that it wasn't about me anymore. It was about my team, my teammates, and how I would do anything for them. Walk across a field to get to where I needed to be to help them. So that was a watershed moment for me. And it really pivoted my mindset behind, I still wanted to be the very best I could be, because that meant that I could do the best job possible. But it also took a back seat to making it so that I was there for the man on my left.
I think we all go through that progression from me to us. Yeah, it was just like, you read, what was it, Call Sign Chaos, General Mattis's book?
Yeah.
And
I haven't read it all, but I have read parts of it.
Yeah. He goes through his career progression from, a lieutenant through general, and hit the different ways of thinking. And it's very similar, but of course I went through the very same thing, where it was, join the military, to get the GI Bill, get those, like you said, like basically the selfish core values, the things that pay off for you. But then along the way, you start learning that it's more beneficial for you when you start thinking of the service, the team, something out external. So it's definitely a progression. I think everybody should go through, at least, but I think everybody does go through.
I agree. I've met a few guys that they had that from the get-go, and I met a few guys that never really figured it out. Mm-hmm. But I think the vast majority of it at some point in their career face that same kind of crossroads, and they realize that this is what I want. And like I said, it really shaped it. We use the term forged. It really forged me in that manner. And it was, something that was very different. I started thinking about, I saw the world differently, and I saw my personal performance differently. It was like, I never wanted to be the weak link. I always wanted to know, I wanted my teammates to know that they could count on me, that if things got really bad, that I was going to be there no matter what. Mm-hmm. And so that really drove me. That drove me to be, the best at my job. Whatever, our job is very simple. While we have an elaborate, our name is an acronym. Most people know this by now: sea, air, and land. And those are the insertion methods and how we get to the target. But ultimately, we get on a target, and actions on is what we're all about. And that's what I did. That's what I tried to master, was the actions on the objective.
Mm-hmm. Plus, nobody wants to be the dirtbag in the group.
There is that. Nobody wants to be that guy.
Yeah, you got to keep up. And
oh man,
it's of course I don't know, but I've heard from just about every Navy SEAL that it's a very competitive world. You put a couple of SEALs together in a room, and all of a sudden it becomes a competition. And it's the same with EOD.
I'm laughing because it's so true, and it's so in some cases it's ridiculous how much I love to tell this story. We're at a range, and me and my swim buddy we're unboxing all the crates of ammo from the back of the truck, and we start opening up each of the cases. And each case of 5.56 has 2 ammo cans, and you basically, but almost like same with the 9mm, 2 can. In fact, I think it was 9mm. It was 9mm. Mm-hmm. So we opened up this case of 9mm, and he took a can, I took a can, we dumped them out, and then before you knew it, we were racing each other to see who could unbox their can of ammo the fastest. and I mean, it was hilarious because, the funny scene about, if you can just imagine this, there's 2 guys that are just, at first they start off just kind of very blasé, opening these boxes of ammo and dumping the loose rounds into the can. And then before you know it, things start to,
brass starts flying all over the place.
Everything. It was hilarious because before we finished, there was about 3 or 4 guys that were watching us. And then all of a sudden it became like a rooting fest. Like, oh, I got $5 on Jeff. $5.
Nobody thought it was ridiculous. They became a sporting event.
It became exactly that. It was like, who's going to win it? Who's going to win? I got 5 on Jeff. Oh, I got 10 on Dave. So it was just funny as hell. But you're absolutely right. You put the standing joke, you put 2 frogmen in a room. What do you have? You have a race.
It doesn't matter. I mean, it could be. I think this is the same within EOD. The server puts down a couple, the paper boats of chicken wings. I can finish these first.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that also reminded me. That was one of the reasons I didn't go Navy EOD, was because at the time EOD wasn't a rate either, and they weren't taking. Like, I put in my chit. And we're not taking cooks into the EOD program. So
it was frustrating. I mean, it's great to see this, that now we have our own rating. And I'm not privy to whether or not EOD has their own rating, but I would imagine they probably do at this point. If not, that's probably the next big step for the Navy. And I feel like it's, and just so the audience understands what this means, whether it's the SEAL teams or EOD, what is at stake here is rank. So we, in a small organization like the EOD community and the SEAL team community, we're a very small organization. We are competing with the rest of the Navy for the next billets for rank. But we're competing with the rest of the Navy in the whatever the source rating is that you have. In my case, it was an intelligence specialist. Mm-hmm. Now, I was very lucky because there was a lot of bleed over between the intelligence specialist field and the SEAL teams, but other ratings didn't have that. And so you were competing in a field that you really didn't work in. Mm-hmm. And it was rough. It was rough to make rank at that point. And now that we have our own rank or our own rating, what it means is that we're being judged amongst our peers, the rest of the SEAL community, which I believe is the best way to do that, because now I think it's a better process of, rank assumption, in my opinion. I think it's a much better way than what it was when I went through.
Do you think you sacrificed something though in that transition, because at least you were pulling from other experience groups, say corpsmen, bosuns, electricians?
Yeah. Well, the good news, yes, to answer your question, I do feel like, and everything is cyclical. Everything is cyclical to some degree. Mm-hmm. So when I went through as a BUD student, the ratio of fleet sailors that would come through was much smaller. The fresh candidate right off the streets was the preferred candidate for BUDs. And then when I went back as an instructor, that had kind of changed. They had moved to accepting more fleet sailors into BUDs, the pipeline basically. And I think that was maybe a way to try to offset some of that experience that you were talking about that we lost when we consolidated into our own rate. And it, whether that was a good thing or not, I don't know, but I do know that was something that they had done. And I believe when I was a BUDS instructor, one of the reasons that we were told was it wanted there was like a gap in the ratings once you got to the SEAL team. So there was a lot of senior enlisted, and then there was a lot of junior enlisted, but there wasn't a lot of the, like the middle enlisted, the senior, like right below mm-hmm. the senior enlisted. There was a gap there, and they wanted to try to fill that gap with experience from the fleet. And that was what the justification was that we were told at that time, which made sense because you would have a bunch of E3s and E4s showing up to the team. And then there was a bunch of E6s and E7s and a much smaller group of E5s. Now, eventually, the E5s really kind of took over, I think, at some point. But for the most part, that's kind of what was happening at that time period.
I did not want to become one of those disabled veterans that just sat on the couch feeling sorry for himself. I've always loved being creative. My creative spark was in the kitchen. I loved making others happy with the food I've made. And with this business, I can share that with so many more people.
Order now at eodfudge.com. It's tough to strike a balance because you also get that point where you've got the junior NCOs who have just gotten their Trident, gotten their EOD badge, and they're placed in charge of these junior enlisted that have had a couple of years on them in this that specialty. So you get the experience from around the fleet, but not inside the team.
Yeah.
Anyways, you got to strike a balance there.
I agree. Absolutely. And that's kind of what I think they were trying to do. I feel like it was effective. I've over the last probably 5 to 7 years, I haven't been as plugged in as I would like to be with the community, but you know, I still get the data dumps periodically. So
Where'd you go on your first deployment?
Central, I went down to Naval Special Warfare Unit 8, which is down in Panama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was actually my entire operational career was spent all in Central and South America. It was a great time period for that because narco terrorism was at its apex, and the name of the game was find them, and you know, we would assist the host nation in how they would deal with them. You know, we couldn't necessarily be on direct action missions at the time, but helping them at that point was one of the things that we did really well. So, you know, and it's funny too, because now, you know, we just saw President Trump order the destruction of a narco terrorist boat that was encroaching on our international or encroaching on our sovereign waters there. And there's a big pushback, you know, in the media, which again, you got to take that for what it's worth, about his use of force against that boat and the occupants of the boat. And I'm like, man, we did a lot more back in the day than just blowing up a boat. That's not that big of a deal, to be honest, you know, but that's kind of perception. And we, you know, that's the deal there. But it seems like we are coming full circle back into the the government is referencing them as narco terrorists, which is what we did back in the day. They were referenced as narco terrorists. And so, you know, I'm
media pushing back. That's what
they're
normally supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
But
they're pushing back hard.
Was that?
I said they're pushing back hard.
Well, that's what they do to Trump. But I also I'm enjoying the headlines recently about changing the name of the Department of Defense.
That's going to ruffle some feathers, but
oh, yeah. Well, that's what I think that's part of his game is just throwing stuff out there. Just keep him on his toes. So they're just talking about changing names on this while he's actually, you know, negotiating. He's doing other stuff like moving the embassy from Tel Aviv.
Yes, exactly.
You know, he's doing that kind of stuff behind the scenes. All the while, the press is talking about you can't rename.
We are seeing a master class in diversion and distraction on his part, because you're absolutely right. And let's talk about the proposed change. And it's funny because that's what it originally was. It was the War Department. And it was the War Department because that's what they did. They waged war. When diplomacy failed, the War Department took over. And with the new SecDef in place, everything that I'm hearing points to the first commitment, which is to improve the lethality of the force. Improve the lethality of the force, because when we are employing the military, when diplomacy fails, you know, it is going to get ugly. It's going to get ugly really fast. And so the more lethal we are, the more capable we are, the shorter that excursion hopefully will be, and the faster we can resolve the issue and the faster we can resume peace. And so that's how I've always looked at it. And if folks are going to get wrapped up like, well, it's going to impact diplomatic relations, exactly how is it going to impact diplomatic relations? In fact, what it should do is it should force diplomats to the table and recognize, okay, the last thing we want is for this to escalate to the desk of the War Department. That's the last thing.
Well, you know, the military is a sword and a shield.
100%.
And defense is just the shield. It's like, the Israeli Defense Force is they don't have an expeditionary army.
Yeah.
Though they have plenty of swords themselves. So maybe that's a bad example. But
I get what you're saying.
But it's true. The War Department is a more appropriate name. I like the fact that he's going more literal with things. I have a couple other recommendations, like change the IRS to the Internal Robbery Service. Maybe the State Department into Department of Global Apology. I don't know.
I will say this with under the State Department under Marco Rubio has been impressive. And I'm very much enamored with what he's done. Like listening to him talk about, for instance, we were talking about this earlier, the terrorist, the narco terrorist. And I saw a press conference where he just came out flat out and just said it. It's like the president has been absolutely clear that he is not going to tolerate this anymore, that he has classified them as narco terrorists. Mm-hmm. If they are bringing poison to our shores, interdiction didn't work. Interdiction did not stop the flow of those toxins, poisons, drugs into our country. So destruction might. We destroy enough of those boats or destroy enough of those couriers, and maybe things will change. I know this. I'm open to seeing how it's going to work. I'm open to that. I don't see the downside to it. I mean, obviously, if you're on those boats and conducting illicit affairs, maybe you should have something to worry about. But I also can't control that. So I'm interested in seeing what kind of outcome this new policy might have towards safeguarding our homeland. That's something that I think we should all be on board with.
It's certainly fun to watch. I'm just concerned about the backswing. Every time it's like a pendulum. Every time the White House changes administrations, and it seems like every president is in succession writes more executive orders, reversing the previous administration's executive orders, and then putting stronger, a bigger swing to that pendulum.
I agree. It is fearful to consider that. I am somewhat optimistic, though.
So long as we can put it into law.
That's what I'm hoping for, is that I hope that within the time remaining that many of these executive orders are codified into law, into legislation. And then we can hopefully sleep a little bit more peacefully at night as a result, because you're absolutely right. The pendulum is going to swing in the opposite direction. The question is, are we prepared for that? I think one of the best ways to prepare for that is through an understanding of how has that impacted the average American's lives, these new policies, these new executive orders. Have they impacted them in a positive way? I think it's too early to tell. I think, it's a little too soon to start, celebrating that. But I also am anxious to see that because, sometimes we need to have these massive shifts to shake things up and to see what happens. I mean, just watching them scurry during the Doge days and the blatant waste, fraud, and abuse that was running rampant within the government, I think the American people got a big cup of, oh shit, that's not cool. And so I think if we maintain that type of policy view that, hey, we're trying to shrink the government size, we're trying to take less from taxes, we're trying to improve the quality of life for the American through these various programs, I think the American people will then appreciate that effort, and it'll be reflected in the ballot box in the future.
I think, and I'm guilty of this too, is that many Americans just considered it the way things work.
Yes.
Right? The overspending, the grift. You remember, I think there was news about a special department of the government for something about Africa, and it literally did absolutely nothing except launder some money and pay some special interest and basically pay themselves.
Yeah.
I forget what it was, but
I know what you're talking about. I do recall something along those lines. Yeah.
But it's rampant in the USAID and all that. But you said you spent most of your career in South America. It was with Team 4?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yes, it was.
You know what's funny? I have a Team 4 hat.
No way.
The 4 with the trident.
Yeah.
Some of the guys, I guess they were doing some training. I'm down here by Eglin. And
yes.
I literally do not know how they found me, or it just kind of like swung by one day. A bunch of these SEALs came by one day with like a suitcase of Bush and a handle of George Dickel. And they gave me a hat, and we hung out for a little bit, and then they were off. And I was like, that was
so cool.
Yeah, it was a cool visit.
That is awesome.
But
I would say that is awesome.
Yeah, that was really cool. I know some of the 7th group guys who helped me train for my first mountain expedition down in Peru. So
no kidding.
That was maybe one of the connections there. But also I recently spoke with Colonel Scott Mann about some of his experiences, and I remember you told a story. I don't know what, maybe it was with Jack Carr, that about going down there and training their forces, the rebel forces, and these generals going into the jungle, taking off their boots.
Oh, yeah.
And you kind of going through this like mindset shift. And it was a great picture of having a picture of your own world and getting expanded, having worked overseas. Colonel Mann also had a similar thing where he was talking to one of the local military guys, and it was like a sergeant major or master sergeant equivalent, and going to his house and having wall full of those certificates of appreciation from the military, from the Green Berets.
Wow.
And just realizing how much they appreciate the recognition. For us, that kind of stuff it could be printed off as like a junior firefighter thing, for a kid at the local fire department. For them, it's really important. But what you're talking about, you realize these guys are really doing the job. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I think the story that you're referencing was we were in Peru, and we were working with our counterparts down there. Great group of guys. One of the things about the Peruvian, the Naval Special Warfare that they have is that it is a virtual duplicate of our Naval Special Warfare, to include their compound. Their compound is built exactly like our compound, or our old compound. We have a new compound now. The O course was an exact copy of our O course. The way they train their members to become their version of the SEALs, it was virtually the same. Mm-hmm. And I gained a lot of respect for them. I've worked with a lot of other countries, and I've worked with a lot of other special operations, and they all have a tremendous amount of capability and force that they bring to the table. But these guys were really top notch. And I remember we were down there training them, and ironically, we were training them on jungle warfare. And we would go out into the training area for Monday through Friday. We'd come back Friday afternoon. And sometimes we'd work in the compound. Sometimes we'd go out to the training site. Sometimes we'd go out to the ranges. And I remember we were coming back, and it was like a Friday. I think it was maybe we came back a day early. And they said, wait, we're really sorry. We're going to have to cancel training tomorrow. We've got an op that we got to do, and we'll see you guys on Monday. Which meant that we had a 3-day weekend to go into Lima and hang out. And it was a great time, great city. It was fantastic, liberty and whatnot. So Monday morning we show up there, and I'm part of the team that's doing the teaching, and I'm up in the front of the classroom, and they start to trickle in a little bit. And there's a couple that are like in bandages. There's one that was on crutches. They walk in, they sit down. There was about maybe one, possibly two that was still missing because they had a mirror image of our team force. So they had the exact same number of bodies. And I remember my chief went over to go talk to their chief and was like, you know, what's wrong? You know, we didn't know anything. We didn't have no idea. And the chief goes on to explain. He's like, hey, listen, you know, here's what happened. So basically what had happened was the op that they had was to go hit a narco terrorist camp. And they went into the bush to do that. They went into the jungle. They hunted these guys down. They got into a firefight. They killed a bunch of bad guys. They took some casualties on their own. And so one of the guys that wasn't at that training was in the hospital. The other guys that were bandaged up had taken shrapnel wounds and some bullet wounds, and they were still there. So I found it ironic that here I am, a Navy SEAL down here in Peru, teaching these guys jungle warfare after they just went out into the jungle and fought narco terrorists and came back. It seemed a little, I don't know, it just seemed a little off for me at that point. I remember I'm up there, we're doing the teach back stuff, and I'm just like, you know, I feel like a fraud almost in front of these guys.
Maybe you guys could show me a thing or two.
Yeah, I'd had a lot of time in the jungle. I did my fair share of work in the jungle, and I felt very competent. And then working with these guys, the jungle boot thing. So I was a point man. And so we kind of paired up with the, our counterparts, and we would go off and train individually with these guys. And so I remember we were going to do a joint patrol with a live hit, basically a training thing, but it was going to be live ammo and everything. And so we were partnered up, and I was working with my counterpart. And I remember we're inserting off their attack boats. And as we're getting up there, you know, I'm kind of hunkered down, kind of low, just looking at the terrain, kind of figuring out what's happening. And I glance over, and my counterpart, the other point man, he's undoing his bootlaces. And I was like, okay, right? So he's undoing his bootlaces. I get back up to, like, I'm looking because, you know, I don't know when we're going to make we're going to be contacted at some point. It could be an insertion, actions on, extraction, whatever. So I'm kind of alerted. I'm looking and kind of guiding the coxswain into the right spot to drop us all off. And I look back again, and now he's got his boots off. And they're sitting there, and he's taking his socks off. And I remember I look back at the shoreline. We're really close to inserting, and he takes his boots, ties them together, and wraps them around his neck. Grabs his rifle, and we jump on to land. He's barefoot, and I'm wearing jungle boots. And I remember thinking to myself, what the hell? And we heard about this. This was lore. This was like maybe some wives' tale rolled into this, but seeing it firsthand, watching somebody that actually patrolled in the jungle barefooted was awesome. It was awesome. Like I'm thinking my feet, no, I cannot do that. But you know, he had grown up in the jungle without shoes. He had grown up that way. So for him, being out in the jungle without shoes wasn't a machismo thing. It was how he would better interacted with the environment, how he felt more in tune to the jungle. That's the key that I took away from him. So I sat down, and I remember when we got back to the camp, I was like, you know what, I might try that. I might see how that works, you know, just see if I can maybe get more in tune to the environment. Nope, no, thank you. That just isn't going to work. Not at all. And it had been his entire virtual life that he had walked around barefooted. So their feet were obviously durable and capable of handling that. He also knew how to walk, which I thought was so incredibly valuable. Just like watching him walk was like watching like a predator walk. It was very, very interesting because we would take turns bounding in front of each other as we patrolled up to where our target was. And so I got a chance to kind of like really pay attention to him. And it was very impressive to watch that. And I remember once, and so my biggest concern was when we went loud and we started shooting all the hot brass on the ground and everywhere. And now we're moving much faster. We're not sneaking and peeking anymore. Now we're way more aggressive. And I was thinking, oh man, that's going to be bad. Nope. Didn't care. Didn't matter. He punched through it all. I'm sure he stepped over brass or stepped on hot brass, but it didn't bother him one bit.
You know, it's funny. We were just talking about more of the politics and the cultural aspect of things, but that's a great example of why, you know, mixing different cultures or experiencing different cultures. That's the benefit of, say, diversity, not just shoving different colors of people together. You know what I mean? Do we have every color of the rainbow represented here? They're not. Doesn't necessarily have to be the actual best or of a particular flavor of person, but you're working with a professional in a similar career field, but you're learning the tactics, the methods, the TTPs of jungle warfare from a jungle warrior.
That's so true. I mean, and I mean, like, to your point about I kind of changed my perspective a little bit. I still believe that we were the best of the best, and when it came down to it, we were going to do the best. But as I interacted with more and more country special operations forces, I started to recognize that we had some gaps, we had some shortcomings. And working with these other organizations helped me to identify what those gaps were. Now, I might not have, as an individual, been able to fill the gap for the community, but I believe that it helped. If I was picking up on these gaps, my hope was that other teammates were picking up on the similar gaps and they were fulfilling them in their little space and whatnot. And so it was very, at first I didn't like doing it. And not to sound crude, but at this time period, people have to understand that there was a lot of political turnover, a lot of it. And on one deployment, I could be working with one country and they're in the good graces. And then the next deployment, I'm down there and now they're the enemy. And it was like that. And so I sometimes was a little reluctant to be as forthcoming with some of those locations, with some of those countries. But what I can recall was that every place that I went, I learned something. Mm-hmm. From a tactical or strategic point of view, I learned something. And that was how I kind of approached it. It was like, okay, what am I going to learn here? What am I going to get? What am I going to take back that is going to bring value to my community? It's going to help bring a measurable impact to what we do. And when I put that lens on and I looked through those lenses that way, I found those things that would fill the gaps, our blind sides. Because what happens a lot of times is we get caught up in how good we are, and I'm talking metaphorically, and that allows us to sometimes become a little bit lax in other areas. Mm-hmm. And so that allows a little bit of stagnation, and that stagnation is what creates chaos.
You forget what made you that great.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. You kind of get flat-footed. Exactly. So being involved with those other organizations, those other countries, kept my perspective sharp. Like, it's like, hey, because I'm not going to say that I have not made mistakes. I've made so many mistakes, Guinness Book Records mistakes. But what I've tried to recognize in my mistakes was, what did I learn from this? And so early on, I might have had like a chip on my shoulder. But as I matured, I started to recognize the value of, what can I learn from these people? What can I take away? What can I take back? And I would pass that down to my juniors, like whenever they would go to a training school or whenever they'd go to some location, whatever the case might be, my parting words to them before they would leave would be like, listen, I don't care what the school asks you to do. If it's, obviously if it's morally, ethically, and legally good, then do it.
Yeah, because you're going fast. It fail often, exactly. Would fail small.
Yeah, exactly. But you're going there to represent the community, to bring back information, to bring back knowledge, to help us improve. Mm-hmm. So whatever they ask you to do, do it. Learn as much as you can, bring that back, because your job is to increase our lethality. We're sending you to this location to do that. So if they ask you to wear a skirt, sitting upside down, doing something, do it. Just get pictures.
Was that the inspiration for the first book? When did that come along?
Good question. So the first book was, I had left the Navy and I had transitioned into the civilian world, and I started working for a company and it didn't work out. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of was floundering, and a teammate was like, "Hey, there's this gig. I can get you in on it. It's a pretty good gig, and you'll still be working overseas, still be doing stuff." And I was like, "Okay, I'm down." And I was just scratching the surface on the civilian shooting community when that happened. And what I noticed was, not like at first, our training programs were very aggressive, very intense. And because that's all I knew. That's how I trained my guys.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I would train anybody, no matter what their background, no matter who they were. And what I noticed was that there wasn't any good information at the time. There were 2 or 3 books that talked about the combat style shooting and what that really looked like and what that meant. And so what I tried to do was synthesize my experience into what I consider to be, like a very well written book called The Combative Fundamentals. And the premise behind that was very simple. It was like, hey, master the basics and then execute them faster than the bad guy. That's it. That is all there is to it. So when I first got into the civilian world, I recognized that there was a gap in resources. And that's what the book was supposed to do, is fill that gap. And it was also a way to introduce my thought process, my mindset to the civilian world as far as how I train and how I train other people. So that was kind of the impetus behind it. And I was so surprised by its success. And I've always said that I wanted to do a follow-up to that book. And I really did. And I went in a different direction. But I wrote that book. What's funny is when I started working overseas again, I was the advanced team member. And so I would go out and jump ahead of all the teams that were coming out there, set up everything. I'd stay on the ground for maybe a day or two, and then I would bounce to the next country and do the same thing there. And I just would do that leapfrogging in front of everybody. And when I was done with my advanced work, I would basically have I would have time off to do whatever I wanted until the team arrived. And sometimes that was a day. Sometimes that could be 2 or 3 days. Mm-hmm. And I had this old, like back in the day, this laptop. This thing was a clunker, man. And I would just go into my hotel room and I would just type away. And so I think it was like 2 of those deployments that I was able to write that book and get it. Like on one deployment, I wrote the pistol portion. On the second deployment, I wrote the rifle portion. And then we got them all merged together and got them, we self-published. That was the other thing that was very new to me, was self-publishing. And, like I said, at that time, which was 20 plus years ago, that book really killed it. It did a great job. And I still get a lot of compliments about that book in today's world. And, it's out of print because we focused on the other book that we released a few years ago. But that one was and I'll tell you a story about that book too. Here's a funny story. Mm-hmm. So when I was leaving the Navy, there's a variety of opportunities for you. And one of those opportunities was within the State Department. And so I went to go and interview with the Diplomatic Security Service for the State Department. And that was up in LA. I was stationed in San Diego at the time. So I went up to LA. And I remember I went out there and went to their main office. I had to do a test and I had to do an interview. And I remember when I was doing the test, it was basically writing essays. I basically had to read a situation. They would give me like a brief, and this is the situation. Here's the situation. Now, write this report based on that situation. So I was like, okay, I could do that, right? Thought I was, at the time I was also going to school. I was going to school part-time while I was still in the Navy. So I thought, okay, yeah, I got this. This would be good, So I go in for my interview. The interview went well. And then I go in to meet with the head guy. He sits me down in his office and he's like, your hard skills are solid. There's no question about that. But your soft skills, in particular, your writing, they kind of are lacking. So we're going to ask you to maybe go out and take a class on, writing, and then come back and interview again. And I'm sure at that point you'll be good to go. And I was like, man, thanks for that feedback, but I'm not coming back. If you don't take me now, I'm not coming back. And so I left. And like about 6 months later is when I started writing that book. So the very first copy that I received was mailed to the head of that DSS office that turned me down. And I was like, hey, thanks for your inspiration. I wrote this book as a result. And it was just kind of like a way to close that loop for me in a sense. I am not a great writer. Like, Jack Carr is a great writer. I am not a great writer. I write about technique. I write about, procedures. I write about how to improve, how to gain mastery. That's what I write about. So yeah, I probably have some schooling to go to figure out what they really wanted, but I just didn't want to do that.
You didn't write like the Navy evaluation style?
Probably, yeah. The creative articulation. Yeah.
What does that even mean?
I would read some of these evals and I'd be like, this is me? Wow. Okay.
I know. Just cut and paste from your standard phraseology. Exactly. Thesaurus of Navy terms and phrases.
So true.
Model sailor. Yeah.
It was very much. But that was such an interesting time period for me as well, writing. And it became something that brings me tremendous joy now. I've published 2 books. I write a blog for my own website, and I contribute to some of the nation's most prominent publications within the firearms industry. Mm-hmm. And, over the years, it's become not just a hobby or a pastime, but it's become something that I really, really enjoy.
Back it up just a little bit. I know a lot of a lot of veterans in general, but a lot of SEALs, they go into the private sector and maybe they do the contracting thing for a while, but then a lot of them become entrepreneurs. And I know guys like Steve Prescia that he's doing sunblock, and there's other guys that are businesses like supplements, and who knows, it's across the board. How did you find your niche in like firearms tactics and training, and then concealed carry?
Yeah, that's a great one. That's a good origin story, if you will. So as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, actions on the objective was what I really focused on. And a lot of times that was shooting, occasionally blowing up stuff, but mainly shooting. So when I left the Navy and, I was still floundering, the one of the last schools that I went to in the Navy was a shooting school. Mm-hmm. And, it was a great experience because, I'd been to a couple of other shooting schools before, but this was right before I was leaving. They really liked me, and they made some very interesting comments about the industry. And I never really took it seriously until after I left the Navy. And I had started Trident Concepts virtually right after I left the Navy. It was like maybe 9 months, 10 months before we really started. And it was doing well because the GWOT was just kicking off, and so most of our customers were, government or, law enforcement at the time. And at that time, there were, I think, 3, maybe I can count the number of special operations instructors well known at the time on one hand. There weren't a lot. And there was one other SEAL at the time. There's actually 2 other SEALs at the time that were doing some training. One of them was a mentor of mine, a Master Chief named Herschel Davis. He's a legend in the community. And the other was a guy that I didn't really work with in the Navy. I think we ran into each other's, we crossed paths maybe once or twice, a guy named Ken Good. And that was it from the Navy side. The Army side, the only other guy that I really knew that had special operations experience that was working was Paul Howe. And so there was if you will, a target-rich environment at that point. There wasn't a lot of people that were training, and it was something that was sorely needed at that point because we were really kicking off with the war. So I got I was at the right time at the right place. That's what I tell people. It's like, hey, I just so happened to be there. When I was on one of my deployments in Afghanistan, it really kind of hit me hard. It was, shortly after the embassy had opened. We were working there, and some of the support that we had was, like forensic, how to really break down a target with all that sensitive information and whatnot. And organically, we did not have that ability. So they brought people with a background in forensics. And I remember these guys were really good at their job, but they weren't accustomed to being in a combat environment. Mm-hmm. And so when they got on the ground, I think they had pistols only, soft armor. That was it. The first couple of guys that rotated in with us. And I remember when we would always go to the range on a Friday, and they came over one day and said, hey, you guys are going to the range, right? You mind if we come with you? We're like, sure, no problem. And, we had to get them rifles, and we had to get them some hard armor and whatnot. And they started training with us on a regular basis. And I remember I was at one of the senior meetings, and I just brought it up as a observations. But hey, you know what? It'd be really good if all these guys that are coming in, if they could get trained up so that we're not completely responsible for their safety. They can actually be equipped and trained to be able to do what they need to do out there. Because sometimes we'd be out in the field or on a target, and we're having to play double duty, watch in and watch out kind of thing. So I remember the head honcho there goes, "This is a great idea. Why don't you take that for action?" So it fell on my shoulders to start training these guys up when I was in theater. And so we would go out to the range and we would train these guys up and get them. By that point, they were starting to deploy with better equipment. They started deploying with rifles and hard armor and things like that. So we didn't have to outfit them quite as much. It was just the training. And I remember one of my debriefs when I got back to the States was, it'd be really great if those guys, before they deployed, had a train up package of some sort. Great idea. Go ahead and take that for action. So, that's kind of how it started, to be honest, right then and there. I was like, okay. And then I realized that I could do this job, on my own through Trident Concepts. And that's basically what we did. It kind of brought me to a point where the GWOT started winding down. And the next thing that kind of started picking up was the concealed carry market. Concealed carry is a popular subject. And my time downrange was spent in many regards, like on that intelligence package, doing stuff that was, basically evaluations. How can I put it? Like assessment and evaluations. But it also put me in places where I wasn't supposed to look like an American. I wasn't supposed to be with Americans. I wasn't supposed to be doing that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And so I remember when I first got tasked with that mission, I had my orders. And one of the things that I was super excited about with those orders was that it had basically I didn't have to shave, and it was a grooming standard issue. So I was no longer required to meet the grooming standards with these orders, which was very rare back then. Very, very rare. Nowadays, it's not that big a deal. But back then, it was very rare. So it's kind of exciting in that sense. And the ops chief sent me back to the armory to get my concealed carry loadout. And I'm thinking, this is what every guy wants, more gear. Of course, send me back. I'm going to go back and get as much gear as I can. So I went back into the armory, and all the gunners were back there just sitting on their desks. And I walked in there all hippity-hoppity and was like, oh, man, I got these new orders. I need to get my concealed carry loadout. And they're all starting to look at me like, what? And I remember the chief was like, oh, I know what he's talking about. Hang on. He opens up his desk drawer, pulls this item out, and he just tosses it to me. And I remember I was holding it in my hands, looking at it like, I don't know what this is. I know it's some kind of holster, but I don't know what kind of holster. I've never seen this kind of holster before. And I'm in the office trying to affix it to my body to figure out how to use this thing. And he must have just felt sorry for me, because he said kind of like, hey, that goes inside your pants. And I was like, what? You want me to put this in my pants? Or, because at that time it had been all tactical thigh rigs. That's all I knew. Like, that was the holsters that I was used to. And so I looked at that holster, and it was for a Beretta 92F. And we're carrying SIG 226s. So I can't even use the damn thing. So the first time that I went down to do those low-vis operations, mm-hmm. I carried a 226 in my waistband with no holster in the front of my body, not knowing what I was doing. I turned to Hollywood. That's where I was like, how did they, like I watched some of these things about how they did it. Like the Magnum PI was really big back then. And so he never wore a holster unless he wore a shoulder holster, and he always put it in his pants, but he always put it behind him. The first time I sat down in a chair with a pistol behind me like that, I was like, this sucks. I'm not doing that. So I put it in front, and that's how I ran for years, But I created what I found out, and this was what kind of also elevated us in the concealed carry world, was that there was no training. There was no professional standards for how to carry concealed. There was nothing. Concealment holsters were there was three to five holster manufacturers making them. Mm-hmm. And, you flash forward to today, and it's such an incredibly popular subject, and, gear and equipment has changed to accommodate that. We're in an apex of that subject right now. So I wrote a book. My second book was on concealed carry, based around my experience in working low vis stuff overseas. And it just kind of like codified all of that stuff down in a very easily digestible framework for people that are interested in, like, I know about concealed carry. Maybe I've gone and got my license, but I really don't know anything about it. Most concealed carry classes or, like states have varying types of requirements. Some states require you to do a class and do a shooting test. Other states just require a class. Some just require you to sign a document. So it all depends on what state you live in. But there's not as much information on the how to do it. You might be given some information about why to do it, like how to do it legally, like what within the framework of the law, but not necessarily how to actually carry a gun concealed. That's not something that most concealed carry courses provided by the state actually deliver. It's no fault of their own. I don't blame them at all. It's just, that's just the nature of the industry. So that subject became very, very popular pre-COVID, for sure. During COVID, I mean, like concealed carry during COVID just went bonkers because everything was crazy. You had violent protests going on. You had defunding the police going on. You had this, basically quarantine kind of condition where if you managed to go to a grocery store, there were some concerns about theft and robbery as a result of that because the resources were also in question. So all of those formed a perfect storm of interest in concealed carry. And so the book kind of hit the market right about then. It did really well. And that book is still in print. And I really do. I was very happy with how that book came out. I learned a lot from writing the first one that I put into that second one. So that was a fun one.
I've got 3 young boys. So the biggest concern for me about robbery is those boys. Really, I don't need to carry around them. All I need is a wooden spatula, and that it keeps most of the incidents down. Really, but what are some of the? Well, for one, where's like the most? You mentioned like the sitting, tugging behind your back in the belt is totally uncomfortable when you're sitting. So where's one of the best access and most comfortable locations to conceal weapons? Well,
that's like asking what's the best truck out there. It's really hard to give a good answer that will suffice the entire general population. Yeah. Here's what I will say is this, a couple things. If you're looking to conceal, the first thing that you might want to consider is what type of firearm you want to carry. And if you're going to be concealing, I recommend that you go with a smaller, subcompact type firearm. It'll be easier to conceal, number one. And you have to put it in perspective. The likelihood of a private citizen needing to use a firearm in the defense of their life or the life of a loved one is very, very rare. However, when it happens, it's also very, very bad. So even though you might want to to carry a very small firearm, I recommend that you carry a small enough firearm that you can still be deadly with it. And that goes into caliber and capacity and sight systems and the shootability of it. So that's another can of worms to get into. But I do recommend that people start with something a little bit smaller. Conventional wisdom said that you should start with a full size because it's easier to shoot, it's easier to train with. But the reality is that most people don't train. They are just going to carry. And so if I tell somebody to get a full size gun and then they try to carry that concealed, it's not as comfortable. It's harder to carry concealed. So they end up not doing it because of that. So if I encourage them to try a smaller platform, they generally have a better experience, which tends to lend itself to, now I want to train with this. Now I want to learn how to get better. So it kind of solves it's a self-correcting error at that point.
Yeah, that's a great point about not training with your firearm, even if it's concealed or exposed. You're exercising your Second Amendment rights means exercise, your practice. Yeah,
so true.
That right comes with responsibility. So
I agree.
Yeah. And that was another thing that you mentioned was that the people you train, they're going to be sent out in life or death situations. So it's not like me starting my entrepreneurial endeavor making chocolate. Your product is it's a very serious matter. I'm sure you recognize that, and it's probably one of the main drivers behind what you're doing.
That's a great point, and it is. I want to address that for sure. But just to close the loop on your earlier question, as far as location on the body, where to carry, I definitely recommend that you carry on body, not off body, so not in a purse or a bag or anything like that. And as far as on body, I would recommend that a new shooter or somebody new to concealed carry carries on their strong side, which would be the 3 o'clock position. And whether they carry in the waistband or on the waistband, that's up to them. But I would carry it I would suggest on the strong side. Now, shifting to the most recent question, one of the things that I tell up and coming instructors is to recognize that what you're doing is that you are potentially training, educating somebody that will have to use those skills to protect life. In the process, they may end up taking life. But the prime directive is that they are protecting life. That's what we do. We protect. So you have to make sure that you can share that with the student body that you have in front of you. Because not to do that means that they sidestep a very big emotional barrier that they have to confront, which is, are they willing to take a life in order to protect a life? That's a hard question, but I recommend that everybody that is going to carry a firearm for defense ask themselves that. Because if you can't, now it's just a talisman. And now it's potentially a danger to the public. But if you ask that serious question, am I willing to protect my life, the life of my loved ones, by taking a life, and you are good with that? And by the way, that doesn't make you a bad person. It means that you value. It's like going back to the military. How can I have, I don't hate my enemy. I don't hate them. I just love the people behind me more. And I'm willing to do whatever I can and will do to protect them. So it's kind of the same philosophy. I don't have hatred towards somebody that would do me harm, but I promise you that if I'm trying to protect my family or myself, that will be the prime. And I will do whatever I need to do to do that. So the maximum level of violence that I can muster will be directed at protecting life. So if you can come to grips with that first question, I think that's a big step towards that responsibility comment that you made. Because you have a responsibility, and that first responsibility is going to be if you're looking to carry a firearm for protection, but you haven't asked that question, it's a false sense of security. And unfortunately, that can potentially put you in a worse situation than you might want to be. If you have answered that question, I do believe that you could probably carry a firearm in the most untactical way ever and never, ever need it for the rest of your life. And that would be amazing. That would be wonderful, right? But if you are going to carry, it's for that unexpected, unplanned event. I always tell people this: we're training for an unknowable, unknown event, right? It's not like I know that in 15 minutes, I'm going to step out my door and I'm going to be confronting a bunch of bad guys and I'm ready for it, right? Unlike hitting a target when I know and I have control over that timeline, I don't have control over that timeline. The bad guy dictates when the time of their attack is going to be. So in essence, I have to be ready all the time. I have to be prepared all the time. And that's that hefty responsibility. And we talk a little bit about that. That's one of the things I'm really happy about within that book, is that we talk a little bit about that responsibility. After you've gone through that, you start to recognize, okay, I am charged with protecting life, my family's life. Do you want to do that with maybe the 50 rounds a year that you might fire, like one box of ammo? Or is it worth it to you and your family to maybe expend, maybe 10 times that, maybe 20 times that? I don't know, but it's like, it's a skill like anything else. And if you don't practice the skill, do not be lulled in this false sense of security that you will have that skill. A famous mantra that we know, I'm sure this was around back in your time as well, is nobody ever rises to the occasion. They're going to default to their level of training. And if your level of training is squat, that's what you're going to default to. You're not going to be the hero stepping up and killing it. You're going to default to whatever level of training it is. And that's what constantly pushes me as well. Even in this day, even currently, I still push myself. I still am charged with protecting not just myself, but my family. And so I still train. And an argument could be made that I could lay back on my accolades and be comfortable there, but I choose not to. I choose to train. I don't train as much as I used to back in the day, but I still train. And I've been training long enough that my skill set is somewhat automated and requires less maintenance these days. But that's the privilege that I have for being in this game for a profession, as a profession. Not everybody has that. Not everybody wants that. So I always try to encourage people to consider that. It's a heavy toll, and it needs to. And the other thing I tell up and coming instructors is you're going to have maybe you don't, but if most instructors at some point will have a phone call from a student that will start off something like this. Hey, Jeff, I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for what I learned in my class with you, because I was involved in a defensive gun use and I had to use those skills to defend my family. And my family and I are safe. The bad guy's down. And it's a call that you might get. You may not. I've gotten several of them. And those calls are very affirming. They're very gratifying and humbling, right? But you also have to be prepared for those other calls, the calls where the student didn't live. And in my career, I've taken way too many of those. Some of them from law enforcement, some of them from military, some of them from the civilian world as well. And those calls are gut wrenching. They're hard on the psyche. They're hard on you personally, because you can't help but question, did I do everything possible to give this person everything they needed to be prepared? And that's what I talk about, the burden of being an instructor in this field, is that if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to put that effort in, then don't do it. There's plenty of guys that are doing a great job, but I sometimes question some of the others out there, because those calls, the calls that came, and people are really, they will pump up the fact that they had a student survive a defensive gun use, which I think is great. But, you know, it's inevitable that you're going to find somebody that didn't win that fight. It's, you know, there's no way that you can predict that you can win that fight. You just hope that you do. And if they don't, it's a hard pill to swallow.
And you, going back to the training part of it, the practice. A day at the range is never a bad day, especially
Agreed.
when you're taking the family. Well, you know, I have just a question. What type of firearm would you recommend for somebody maybe slightly visually impaired?
Maybe a shotgun.
Just kidding. All of my accessibility devices, my cane, my prosthetic eyes, all of those things are actually manufactured by His Majesty's Secret Service, the Q branch.
Oh, very cool.
Yes, very. Yeah, I'm a very dangerous man. I think it's a really good place to transition to our final segment, the countdown to impact. This is a 3, 2, 1. Real quick, 3 books, 2 quotes, and 1 person who have all made an impact in your life.
Fantastic. Okay, 3 books. I would say the first one that comes to mind is a book from Trevelyan called Shibumi. It's a fantastic book. Another book that I would recommend is How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And then the third book would be the Bible. So Excellent. Those are my 3. Mm-hmm. My favorite quote that I rely on a regular basis is like, the only easy day is yesterday. And that's from the SEAL teams. And that's a constant reminder to, you know, you can't, you know, every day is going to be a hard hitting day. Every day is going to be a day that requires you to put forth your very best. And the only day that you can relax is yesterday. Every day you have to be willing to kind of bring it. And that really kind of forged a different mindset in me. Then another phrase that I'm very enamored with is the deeds, not the glory. Verba non facta. And that basically means, you know, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. Right. And so, you know, that means for me, I have to share, I have to be able to demonstrate whatever it is that I ask of people to do. If I can't do it, I can't expect the other people to do it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of that one. And also, you know, I naturally kind of shun the limelight. I try to not be so committed to, I like my low profile condition. I do, but I recognize in today's world that it's more about public profile and engaging with the audience and being available. And so I do make myself available and try to do that. And I try to instill in people these same character traits that I try to live by. The number 1, what was the one again?
1 person who's made an impact in your life.
One that stands out is a master chief who spoke some very, very terse words to me one time. I was leaving the East Coast, going to the West Coast to be an instructor. And I had volunteered to take those orders from another team guy that was having some family problems. And so I wasn't crazy about doing it. But I remember I was checking out of the team area and I went into the training. He was running the training at the time. And I went into the training hooch to check out. And he's like, "What's going on?" I'm like, "Well, you know, I'm transferring over to the West Coast, going to Buds." And he's like, "Good for you." It's like, "Well, you know, I'm not crazy about it. I want to stay out here. I want to keep pulling triggers. I want to blah, 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 blah." And I remember he stood up from his desk, got in my face, and and I can't remember exactly the words that he uttered, but it was to this effect. He's like, you earned your trident off the shoulders of other SEALs. You now have a responsibility to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. So it changed my mindset about going out to Buds and being an instructor out there. You know, I had earned my trident by standing on the shoulders of great men. And those men helped me to become the SEAL that I was. And so I had an obligation to go out to the schoolhouse and do the same thing there. Help those young men become SEALs as they went into that pipeline. And that was, that was just one of the many things that I learned from him. But that moment was kind of like a little rattling to me, because I was all negative. And he just, man, he put that to rest. He's like, you need to change your attitude. You get out there and you need to share that information. Mm-hmm. You need to share it with as many people as you can, which is probably one of the reasons why I took, once I left the Navy, why I gravitated towards the firearms training world or towards being an instructor and a leader in that industry, is probably because of that.
That's awesome. All right, last two quick questions. One,
go for it.
And I'll let you go. One is, what does living a life of impact mean to you?
That is also, so like, I like to think of terms in how am I impacting my students? Am I impacting them in a meaningful way? And so I'm very intentional about how I instruct, how I teach, because I want to make sure that I impact them in a very positive way, not just from a role model sense, but also from their framework, their mindset, and how they look at the problem from my lens, if you will. So that's a big one. I really do feel very convinced that that's one of the things that I did very well.
And you pretty much summed that up earlier about why it's important, the training that you do also. And final question, if anybody wants to find out more about you, connect, find your podcast, anything else, where do they go?
So I would send them to our website. It's the best source. It would be tridentconcepts.com. All of our social media links, all of our YouTube channel links, everything is there on our website. They can learn about me. They can learn more about me. They can learn about the training classes. They can learn about other things all off of our website.
Awesome. We'll get that in the show notes. Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your time and your experience with the Point of Impact audience. Disruptor
Aaron,
Nation.
thank you. I've really enjoyed this. It was great getting to know you, great interacting with you. Keep doing the great work that you're doing. If I can ever be of any help or service, just reach out to me.
Will do. Thank you. Same here.
You're welcome.